I thought that since we're focusing in this whole series, which I think is a great idea, on the life and legacy of Tsongkhapa, to start with this short prayer. And it's in the handout right there at the top. The prayer is called the Miktsema. I don't know if, I assume some of you know a great deal and some of you may know very little. So, Miktsema. It's just this 5-line prayer. And I'll say this prayer and then we'll make a couple comments about it to get started. Avalokiteshvara, great treasure of non-objectifying compassion. Manjushri, master of stainless wisdom. Vajrapani, destroyer of the entire host of Maras. Tsongkhapa, crown jewel of the sages of the land of snow. To Tsongkhapa, Losang Drakpa, at your feet, ask for blessing. Yeah, make requests. So, Miktsema is kind of, I guess you'd say, condensed form of Mikme Sema, which means like compassion that doesn't observe anything. Which is like, well, what would that be, right? But this is actually an important concept. Comes from Chandrakirti, the idea that there are different kinds of compassion and, or we could say loving care. Sometimes I'm trying to say loving care for compassion. And one is the clearly straightforward idea that there's some living beings here who are suffering, and I would wish that they wouldn't, and would aspire to help them. And another is, well, there's some living beings here who are radically impermanent, changing instant by instant, and who don't know that, and thereby suffer as a result of not understanding their own very subtle continuous impermanence, which I do see, but they don't. And then the third, which is what is referred to here as non-objectifying compassion or objectless compassion, is the idea that there's some beings here living beings here who are empty of any inherent existence of their own, but through not seeing that, are bound in cycles of needless suffering, age after age. And I would wish that they be free from suffering. So it doesn't, in all three cases, actually, your compassion is for living beings. But this third type of compassion is called non-objectifying compassion, because it's a compassion that doesn't reify the living beings. It's a compassion that's infused with the force of understanding emptiness, right? And brings the force of having understood emptiness together with your compassion. So this is a very important idea, because then you don't think of yourself as the great savior and get caught up in some ego trip about yourself, and you don't pity the people that you're trying to help because you don't have any extra stories or superimpositions about them, right? Because you understand that you're empty of any intrinsic nature, that they're empty of any intrinsic nature, that the whole process is empty of an intrinsic nature. And it's because they don't understand it that they're especially, is especially important to try to care for them, because that's going to catch them in suffering. So that's what that means, reifying compassion. And, the idea is, and this relates to, thing I'm going to talk about this weekend, is trying to bring together in a single mind, the force of wisdom and the force of compassion, or the force of loving care and the force of insight, into the nature of reality, to trying to bring these together in a single entity or a single moment. This is the idea of the Buddha, the awakened one in the Mahayana tradition, is that being a perfect embodiment of loving care and wisdom. And it's not necessarily the ideal of Buddhism, maybe in every tradition, but it certainly is in Mahayana. And this is reflected in the prayer. So Manjushri is wisdom, Avalokiteshvara, right, is in the great treasure of compassion. And Vajrapani represents here the power to overcome obstacles, to get things done, to eliminate the afflictions of greed and hatred and delusion. So, you could imagine in principle that there was a mind that had wonderful compassion and great insight, but was located in a being who was utterly powerless to do anything to help anybody, right? Hypothetically, right? Maybe, right? But that's the idea here, is that that loving care is a state of mind, but we want to enact and follow through on that state of mind and be able to be effective in helping others. So that's how I understand this prayer. Being motivated by loving care for others, seeing into the nature of things as empty, but also having the capacity to go out and enact those things in relationship to others. So as I don't know if you know, but we'll get to this this morning. This is a prayer that essentially in this form was originally written by Tsongkhapa for his teacher, Rendawa. And Rendawa, according to the tradition at least, said, well, that's really more appropriate as a prayer for you. And then Rendawa turned it around this way and wrote it in this version for his disciple, who was also then, in a way, his guru, right? And this idea that a disciple can also be a guru and a guru can also be a disciple in some cases, we don't usually think of it that way, but in Tsongkhapa's life, it was like that a lot. Because he studied at the feet of, we think maybe 50 different people, roughly speaking, and many of them also received teachings and tantric initiations from him that he'd gotten from other people. So there was a lot of this mutual respect. So I gave a little outline of the things I aspire to cover this weekend here. And the first one is sort of an overview and historical context. So then we'll talk a little bit about the life of Tsongkhapa, Tsongkhapa's understanding of the tantric tradition, Tsongkhapa's understanding of Madhyamaka in relationship to the path, which is, as Lim was saying, the thing that I've written about the most. And then if time allows, we'll say something about his hermeneutic, his way of reading scripture and how it's different from some other people. When I was 18, so that was a long time ago. I was like 46 years ago, almost a half century ago. When I was 18, I read my first, I knew some things about Buddhism, but I read my first whole book about Buddhism at 18, which was a book by Edward Kanza, who's, I guess he was at UCLA. He translated the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras into English, so this was being a long time ago. There weren't that many different introductions to Buddhism. It's hard to sort of conjure this up if you weren't there, but there were very few books to pick from. Okay, so Edward Kanza had written an introduction to Buddhism, so I was assigned to read it in my first semester as a freshman at University of Virginia. And, I went through Life of Buddha, that was like, and then eventually got along to the thing about, what Kanza was going to say about perfection of wisdom and the Mahayana path. And this is what he said, and I have to excuse the androcentric language is actually the real language of the text because I remember it. He said, in his wisdom, the bodhisattva sees no beings, but in his compassion, he takes care of them all, right? I read that and I thought, well, that should be easy if there aren't any, right? So we're off. Yeah, and that you can tell I still remember that line, that was like, okay, this is like I didn't think of it as a koan or something. I didn't think of it like that, but it was sort of like that. It's sort of like it's stuck in my brain. I was like, I think I have to try to understand this in some other way than the way he expressed it. And I mean, some people would be happy with that. Some people are happy with that way of saying it. And this tradition, that goes back to Tsongkhapa, is characterized by this kind of unhappiness with that and wanting to find some way to explain it that makes sense to the kinds of minds that we have now. Anyway, that's, I guess, the connection between me and this tradition. It was before I'd even heard of this tradition. I was like trying to well, there has to be a way to talk about this that makes some sense. So I'm going to just say, in terms of the significance, the overview of what Tsongkhapa's accomplishments are from my point of view. This is the first one in terms of having a way to, without using paradox or without valorizing contradictions themselves as the best way to express the Dharma, how do we articulate a view that avoids the extremes of, let's say, I'm feeling like saying nihilism and fundamentalism today, although that's not usually the word that's used. But and it's not technically exactly right from a history of religion's point of view, because fundamentalism has a very specific meaning. But in the sense of fundamentalism, of feeling like I have to have something absolutely solid that I can grab onto, and then I can build everything else up from there. In that sense, found, that there's some essential fundamental reality that's the basis of things, versus saying, well, nothing matters because nothing really exists, right? And this is this kind of polarity and the extremes in terms of how things exist is the core, I would say, of what has animated Buddhist philosophy throughout all the centuries of its existence is trying to, and I would say different schools and different traditions have different ways of talking about that. But it's always about the middle way, and it's, the middle way between these kinds of extremes. So Tsongkhapa offers one of the most compelling, convincing ways of articulating, exactly what that middle way is. And the one that appeals to me the most, because it doesn't say, well, it's all a mystery, or it's a paradox, but that's why it's so profound. Do you know what I'm saying? It doesn't do that, which is a move that you can make, right? And is made in a lot of religious traditions, including some forms of Buddhism and other religions as well. But then Tsongkhapa is and his successors are sort of determined not to resort to that, right? So I've read a lot of different Gelukpa books over the years where people take little thorny problems that they feel are sort of left over, that you can't ask Tsongkhapa, what did you mean by this? So they're analyzing them in their debate manuals and, arguing them in the debate courtyard century after century. And people figure out a great many things and have a great many different little theories about how to interpret these finer points, of what Je Rinpoche, Tsongkhapa, was teaching. But sometimes they can't really figure it out. And when they figure it out, did they say, it's all a mystery? And no, they don't, because they're Gelukpas. And instead, they say, Jebar Jao, which means this remains to be analyzed. Yeah, in other words, next generation, here, you got some work to do, right? That's the style, and that has always appealed to me. Okay, so that was one thing. That Tsongkhapa's system addresses this in terms of talking about the middle way in a coherent and also very convincing way. And there's either one or two, depending on how you want to count, other kinds of tensions like that Tsongkhapa resolves, or synthesizes in his work. Probably the one that comes to mind most immediately for people is between tantric practice and monasticism. So this is really a big issue in the history of Tibet, and I think probably still an issue in Tibetan Buddhism. Tantric practice involves some of the tantras specifically describe and advise the practitioners of those tantras to do things that would violate not only monastic commitments, but commitments that any ordinary lay Buddhist should have in some cases, or any Mahayana Buddhist for sure. So how to reconcile that? And this was, there are a lot of people in Buddhism, and it includes Tibetan Buddhism, but I don't mean to limit it to that, like, say, Korean Buddhism, for example. There are people who think that because they have insight into emptiness, their perspective or approach to the world transcends the distinctions, which are very dualistic, between virtue and non-virtue. And essentially, because of their profound understanding, any kind of activity they engage in can't even really be characterized as good. It's because it's beyond good and evil. It's a spontaneous manifestation, right, of the wisdom energy of the Buddha or something like that, right? Do you understand? This is like many problems, right? And it's not limited to one particular type of Buddhism. It comes up over and over again, right? So I don't know. It's really important to be careful about that. And how do we, there's these different traditions that have come from India. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute, but His Holiness, you know, in part of the Gelukpa tradition really emphasizes monasticism. But on the same time, he's a tantric practitioner. And when I first tell my students this, oh, look at this picture of Lama Yeshe on the back of our book. You know, his book is about Tantra, and look, he's wearing these robes of a monk. This is like right there already an apparent contradiction to people, because they understand Tantra as being about sex based on the internet. Right? Yeah. So, closely related to that, but distinguishable from it, is the tension between yogic practice and scholarly analysis. So this is a big thing in the history of Tibet too. You know, the idea that we should just go and meditate and practice and set our minds in non-dualistic equipoise, versus we should crack open a book and mix our mind up with a lot more dualistic concepts and words. Do you see what I'm saying? This is like, right? And it's like the people on side A there are like, what the hell is wrong with those Gelukpas? You know, they're just, we have this profound non-dualistic tradition. And what do? They go and produce more and more and more and more dualistic ideas about it, and then encourage people to bathe their minds in it, you know, reinforcing that tendency toward dualistic conceptions. We should just let go of all that. So, you know, there's a sort of connection, right, between the tantric side and the yogi side on the one hand, and the scholar side and the monastic side on the other hand. It's not exactly the same, but, you know, the tradition of monastic scholasticism goes back to India and the Nalanda tradition that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is constantly talking about, is that this is what he understands as the core of what Tibetan Buddhism is about, as he understands it and practices it, at least, is this Nalanda tradition. And then he has the 16 Nalanda masters, and he has, you know, people making new tankas that didn't exist before that have these exact 16 Nalanda masters represented on them. And this seems really great, except that there's another whole tradition that's also at the root of Tibetan Buddhism, and that is the Mahasiddha tradition, who is Virupa. Well, he's not on the tanka of the Nalanda masters, but he's certainly important if you want to understand where Sakyapa comes from, right? And so forth, right? There's this whole tantric yogi rooted in northern India generally, and then coming up into Tibet set of traditions, which isn't really, you know, and it overlaps in some ways with the Nalanda masters in that some of them are considered also to have written tantric texts as well. But, and not that none of the scholar monks were presumably also yogis, but there was a distinction between these two sides of the tradition coming out of India, and Tibet received both of those. And there remains a sense of kind of tension between the two, you know, down to today, with Gelukpas being on scholastic and monastic side of that distinction. So Tsongkhapa had the issue of like, well, how do we fully embody, what the profound teachings of the tantras are? We're going to take some of these antinomian tantras, the tantras that are specifically advising their specialized trainees to engage in actions that would seem to violate the precepts. Are we going to throw that out and say that those aren't the Buddha's words? No, we have to figure out how to incorporate those and within a tradition that preserves the monastic traditions of Buddhism. And how are we going to understand how analysis relates to the understanding, an understanding that is ultimately non-dualistic and therefore non-conceptual, right? So Tsongkhapa has answers to all of those questions, right? And that's how I see in the big picture why he's important and why it still matters today. Roughly speaking, I would say that in the big picture, the first of these things, finding the middle way between fundamentalism and nihilism, is important for everybody, whereas the others are maybe more important for Buddhists in particular, right? And like, how do we understand how to do the practice? But this idea of finding a middle way between fundamentalism and nihilism isn't really a problem that's limited to Buddhism. It's our whole society, right? You can look around and see people feel lost, and then they don't want to feel lost, and so they find something to cling on to, and they have to cling on to it really, really tight because otherwise they're lost, and that leads them to hate somebody else who doesn't accept what they think is the only thing that's worth holding on to, and so forth, right? That's the way it is, right? Yeah. Okay. So that's my overview of what the big picture of what's important about this. And then the context is close. I'm not going to tell the whole history of Tibetan Buddhism, but I just wanted to relate this overview to a little bit of the historical background of Tibetan Buddhism before Tsongkhapa. So we have, in the 7th century, Songtsen Gampo, Tibetan king, 7th century, right? Sends people down into Kashmir to figure out a way to write Tibetan, which they didn't have, specifically so that they could create translations into Tibetan of Sanskrit Buddhist texts, of which he'd become aware and had taken an interest. And they didn't have texts, right? So if you're going to make a text, you have to have a way to write your language. So that's in the 7th century. And His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, doesn't necessarily regard this as the beginning of Tibetan Buddhism when he gives his presentations, because he says it's not really on a secure foundation. It's not clear that anybody understands it. But there's an interest in the in translation, and so the beginning of mixing your mind with the letters and so forth. But they don't have any, authoritative figures coming from India to explain what these texts mean. So in the 8th century, then, you have what His Holiness considers the real beginning of Tibetan Buddhism, when another Tibetan king, Chisong Detsen, invites Shantarakshita, who's one of the Nalanda masters, to come up from Nalanda to, propagate the Dharma in Tibet. And according to the tradition that's come down to us, he has a lot of problems right away with demons and so forth. So, exactly what this looked like, I don't know, right? In what form did how did these demons obstruct his activity? Did they manifest in the form of, political opponents to the propagation of Buddhism, or, feudal lords who didn't want any, I don't really know. Looking forward to Thupten Jinpa's biography of Tsongkhapa. Maybe he'll explain exactly how the demons were going about blocking Shantaraksha's but as a result, Shantaraksha said, well, we need to get somebody else up here beside me, and that would be Padmasambhava. So here you got the thing that I'm talking about. It's like the real foundation of Tibetan Buddhism, as His Holiness sees it, is not the 7th century, but the 8th century, and it's when two guys come up from two guys. Now, first it's one guy, and that guy is in the Nalanda tradition, hence the priority in the Nalanda tradition. But he can't do it alone. He needs this other guy, Padmasambhava, to come up there and help him out with the magical protection side of the business, right? Yeah. To make a long story short, right? And then to connect this over to this other thing about analysis and, how the dualistic process of studying the Dharma connects to a non-dual reality. Shantaraksha's direct disciple, Kamalashila, also one of the 16 Nalanda masters, comes up from Nalanda and, according to the tradition, engages in a 2-year-long debate at Samye with the refereeship of Chisong Detsen, the king, over whether enlightenment is something one attains gradually through activity, which one makes an effort in the path, or whether enlightenment is something that takes place suddenly and without effort, without effortful activity. Maybe we could put it that way, right? So, Hoshang Mahayana, or variously referred to. Some people nowadays are saying, well, he came from China. He may represent some type of Chan, tradition. That was active in China, was because representing this, we say, subitist or sudden enlightenment point of view, that in some sense, fundamentally, we're always already enlightened. And if we could just relax into that, it'd all be cool, right? Right. And so, for whatever reason, after the two-year debate, Chisong Detsen decides, according to the tradition, right, in favor of Kamalashila as having won the debate. It occurs to me that if you have one person who favors analysis, logic, and reasoning, and another person who doesn't, and then you decide we're going to pick between them by having a long 2-year argument, you've kind of stacked the deck in Kamalashila's favor. Maybe if you did a magical feat contest would have been more, Anyway, maybe there should have been multiple rounds. Let's have now the levitation section will start. So Kamalashila wins. So anyway, you can see how those themes and with the Kamalashila versus Hoshang Mahayana and Padmasambhava and Shantaraksha and relate to the things I was talking about before. And then, of course, Tibet goes into a period where Buddhism is suppressed, or at least we can say does not find patronage from any king, and seems to suffer some oppression, but it doesn't completely disappear in Tibet. But it seems for the 9th and 10th century to mainly involve the use of Buddhism or Buddhism-derived techniques for magical protection against demons. And, if you don't know, Tibet is just like so many kinds of demons. I mean, somebody could, if you were going to write the encyclopedia of Tibetan demons, it would be as long as Lama Chemo. I mean, they have so many types of demons, right, and classes of demons, a lot of concern about that. So the tradition needed to be revived. So in the 11th century, another Tibetan king, apparently a king from Tsang, the western part of Tibet, invited Atisha to come and reestablish the Dharma. And from him came the Kadamba lineage. His Tibetan followers were the first Kadambas. And then, of course, Tsongkhapa's first teacher when he was a boy, was from the Kadamba tradition. And, he had teachers from every tradition, but a particular closeness to the Kadamba tradition, going back to Atisha, as we'll come back to that point a little bit later. But although Atisha is, celebrated as the great refounder, right, in the 11th century of Tibetan Buddhism after this period of suppression, he wasn't the only person. There were also people in the Siddha tradition or Mahasiddha tradition who came and established the Sakya lineage and the Kagyupa lineage, right? And those traditions, right? It's not that they don't have respect for Atisha, but they don't have him as the celebrated central figure in their history. They have lineages that run back not so much to Nalanda, but to the people like Virupa, for example, in the Mahasiddha tradition. Okay, so then we come to the century in which Tsongkhapa was born, which is the 14th century. And there's really just one thing I wanted to say about that. And this is like something that remains really important in Tibetan Buddhism, wherever it exists in the world down to today. And that's this distinction between self-emptiness and other emptiness. So if a lot of you look fairly familiar, if you've been studying Tibetan Buddhism in this tradition or at this center for a while, you're familiar with the idea that emptiness means the lack or absence of things, of any ability to exist in and of themselves. And we get so familiar with that we just sort of take it for granted that everybody agrees or understands that what's emptiness is. And if they didn't, that they couldn't be a Tibetan Buddhist or something like that. But actually, that's not the case about that. I mean, that agreement isn't the case because there was a teacher named Dolpapa Sherab Gyaltsen. He died like 4 years after Tsongkhapa was born. So he's, first half of the 14th century figure. And he initially studied in the Sakya tradition, but he had some kind of meeting with the third Karmapa in the Kagyupa tradition, is a man named Rangjung Dorje, and was apparently very influenced by what this teacher taught him. And he developed through studying Kala Chakra, practicing Kala Chakra, doing intensive meditation, studying Madhyamika texts and Yogacara texts. He developed his own interpretation of how all this fit together. In a sense, you could say, just as Tsongkhapa did, except completely different. In other words, he just took all these pieces and fit them together in a totally different way and came out with a totally different answer. And what his answer was that Tathagata Garbha, or self, which he also is fine with using the word self. I guess in English we put a capital S, or Buddha nature, or emptiness, whatever you consider the ultimate, whatever you use for it, it doesn't represent an absence or lack of self-existence in things. It's called emptiness insofar if it's devoid of any of the impure or delusory characteristics of the world as we ordinarily see it. It's the pure and absolute nature of all things. I know if you're just used to the Gelukpa presentation, it sounds very strange at first, but there is a very wide swath of the Tibetan Buddhist world, including the Tibetan Buddhist world in the United States and other places like outside of India and Tibet, a very wide swath of our, fellow Tibetan Buddhists that just take that for granted as being what emptiness means and what the final teaching is. I don't know the head count, right? But one person told me, it was Sidney Pyburn from Snow Lion. He said he thinks it's about 50-50. Now, I don't know I don't think anybody really knows, but by saying it's 50-50, he's trying to get across a point that this is not like, Tsongkhapa, everybody mostly agrees, and then there's these few weird other emptiness people. You kind of get that impression when you look just at Gelukpa sources, but it's really not like that. It's true that the Gelukpa order, as it became strong, did try to suppress some of these ideas. But they weren't really effective in the long run. The idea has persisted down to today and is quite important. So this was in the background in the 14th century, and it is sort of very relevant to Tsongkhapa's life.
So Dolpapa, is that Jonang?
Yes. Okay, so I didn't say the word Jonang, but yes, the Jonangbas is a sect or order, a Churluk, a Dharma system that's associated with this other emptiness view, the view that emptiness is emptiness of other things, that emptiness itself is pure and absolute. You can call it Buddha nature. He's fine with calling it self. It's permanent. It's eternal. It's absolute. All those words that we're used to thinking are on the side of the object of negation. He puts all those words on the side of the ultimate. That's what it means to be ultimate for Dolpapa.
Question.
Yes.
Is it what the Chittamatrans call self-suchness?
So I don't want to identify this view with Chittamatra because it's important to understand that from Tsongkhapa's point of view, this is definitely not Chittamatra. Because Chittamatra is a legitimate tradition coming from texts that were taught by the Buddha sutras, really, whereas he understands this as being sort of beyond the pale, right? But within the third turning of the wheel, if you know that distinction of the sutras, there's sutras that are very supportive of the Chittamatra or mind-only view, and then there's another set which is sometimes separated and sometimes not separated, which focus on Tathagata Garbha view, right? And if you say, well, let's just look at these Tathagata Garbha-oriented Chittamatra views, idealist views supporting sutras, and let's combine those with some highest yoga tantras, right, like Kalachakra, then that's how you get this sort of textual basis for the Jonang, Dolpapa, Sherab Gyaltsen way of looking at the world. That there's this mind, all right, or self that's absolute, right, and everything else is sort of like the delusion, the product of delusion, separating ourselves from this one true reality. Yeah. So, but, when we talk about it like that, it starts to sound like, it was sort of oddball sect that got suppressed a long time ago. But these ideas are, present in, as far as I can see, to some extent, depending on which teacher, like all the other sects of Tibetan Buddhism that aren't Gelukpa. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm not saying that all of these teachers hold that view, but many Kagyupa teachers, it's clear that Dolpapa himself was influenced by a Kagyupa teacher, and teachers in other schools do hold an other emptiness point of view. Yeah. So Tsongkhapa was born in the far eastern part of Amdo, which is the northeastern part of the traditional Tibetan cultural area, in 1357. I have a sort of synopsis of his life story here, and I'll just go through this and make a few interrupt myself a few times for comments. Tsongkha means like Onion Valley, so the person from Onion Valley. 1350. According to tradition, a drop of blood from his umbilical cord fell on the ground, giving rise to a sandalwood tree whose leaves bore Tibetan letters associated with the manifestation of the Bodhisattva Manjushri. So, according to one text I was reading, getting ready to give these talks, there were Christian missionaries who were in Tibet in the early 19th century who went to this place and saw the tree and totally were interested in debunking Tibetan Buddhism, but said, well, yeah, it does have some weird things on the leaves. It's like they would have preferred that it didn't, but then so that's like the most convincing testimony, right? Yeah. His mother later built a stupa on this spot. There are so many legends, about so much folklore and legends about Tsongkhapa, so I'm just mentioning a few things. Today, the location of Tsongkhapa's birth is marked by Khumba Monastery, which is still there. founded in 1583 by the third Dalai Lama, Sonam Gyatso, on the spot of the original stupa. So information I have is that Khumba Monastery got up to about 2,500 monks and now has about 400. But I mean, that means it's still going, right? So at 7, according to his secret biography, he experienced visions of Atisha and the deity Vajrapani. So, right, Atisha, right, and Vajrapani. So he's got somebody from each side, right? Somebody from the Tantra side, somebody from the Sutra side, somebody from the Nalanda tradition, somebody in the Mahasiddha, a deity in the Mahasiddha tradition. And at age 8, shortly thereafter, he received novice monastic ordination, together with the name Losang Chakpa from the Kadam master Turndrup Rinchen. So Losang Chakpa in Tibetan means he who is famous for having a good mind. I don't know. Yeah, you could do different translations. Lo means mind, Sang means good. Chakpa means one who is famous. Chakpa, yeah, a person who is famous. So, could make slightly different interpretations, but that's pretty clearly what it means. And, never know with these names, but it could be that he was already noted as a prodigy because, I mean, he's able to accomplish so much so quickly, right? I was thinking, what can we compare him to? It's like if you watch the movie about Mozart and Salieri, and you think Salieri is this great musician, but look who he's up against. It's sort of like that. Tsongkhapa is like a prodigious genius of the Dharma. And so it's like all the other people who are pretty good or really good have to sort of eventually recognize that there's some kind of serious outlier who's come. So he studied for 8 years until he was 16, mostly with this Kadam master Turndrup Rinchen. And then he went to central Tibet. So that's, I was like investigating this a little bit today. That's like 1,200 miles. So I maybe Thupten Jinpa, when he writes the biography, he's going to tell us, did he ever get on a donkey or anything? I think the folklore is that he walked 1,200 miles. So that would be walking from here to LA, back to here, and then back to LA again, right? So that would take a while. Apparently he didn't do it unaccompanied, but there doesn't seem to be, there are a lot about the man who went along with him. And there are many folk stories about the adventures he had along the way, which we won't get into, is in the area of folklore. But when he got to central Tibet, he just immediately started soaking up, all kinds of Dharma. I mean, really all kinds of teachings. He quickly became qualified as a doctor of Tibetan medicine. I just mentioned that because that's sort of ancillary to his main accomplishments. He wrote 18 volumes eventually of texts. So if he starts publishing in his 20s, right, and then he dies at 62, right, he's cranking out quite a few texts. And when you read the story of his life, I mean, he's constantly going into retreat and meditating and doing prostrations and having visions and having prophetic dreams. And yet he's also constantly going around to different places with different teachers. And yet all these books keep appearing. So it seems sort of paranormal, like how he could possibly do all these things at the same time. Studied with 50 different Buddhist scholars, including teachers from every Tibetan lineage. The most important teacher, we usually say, is the Sakya master Rendawa Shernu Lodra. And Rendawa was a strong proponent of the Prasangika view of Madhyamaka. And for him, that meant Dolpapa bad. Why? Because Dolpapa, Sherab Gyaltsen, had taught what he called Maha Madhyamaka. That means great Madhyamaka. And what made his Madhyamaka great was it wasn't just Madhyamaka. it was a reading of Madhyamaka through the lens of Tathagatagarbha scriptures, Chittamatra scriptures, and vice versa. So, I mean, from our point of view, we would say that he synthesized, Tathagatagarbha, Chittamatra together with Madhyamaka and said, this is the highest Madhyamaka view. And this is the way we should read Nagarjuna, is in light of the Tathagatagarbha literature. So that's not how we're used to doing things in this tradition. But that's, we just take it as like, well, this literature is part of one tradition and this other literature is part of a different tradition. And we're going to try to understand each on its own terms. And that's the opposite of what Dolpapa thought was the right way to go. So because of that, he didn't articulate a prasangika madhyamaka view of, that things are empty of their own nature at all. He advocated this, So Rendawa was a critic of this, and Tsongkhapa, made Rendawa his main teacher in terms of understanding the view. And then I told that Tsongkhapa composed this Miksema verse in praise of Rendawa, and Rendawa turned it around back to Tsongkhapa. But Tsongkhapa practiced, and meditated practiced and studied Madhyamaka for a long time. And his understanding, we could say, gradually became more experiential, moved from, intellectual to experiential. But he still had questions. In his early 30s, a Kagyu teacher, Umapa, who apparently had been a shepherd and then had a vision of Manjushri. So he was able to, make a Umapa. He was able to make a connection with Manjushri. And Tsongkhapa went into retreat with Umapa and would initially pose questions to Manjushri through Umapa. And Umapa, told him, this is Manjushri's private line. This is how you contact Manjushri. And Tsongkhapa, being a quick study, he picked up on it eventually. He didn't need Umapa anymore. He would just contact Manjushri directly. So it's interesting, though, even though he has, he can ask questions of Manjushri, and he's making, deep progress in terms of understanding the view. He wasn't satisfied with his realization. And he picked 8 of his followers and did many years of retreats. And it said that he personally did 3,500,000 prostrations during these retreats, and also over 1 million mandala offerings. During this time, he had a dream where he saw Nagarjuna and 4 of people he understood as being proponents of Nagarjuna's view: Aryadeva, Chandrakirti, Bhavaveka, and somebody named Nagabodhi, who's actually a tantric master. And he saw these guys, having a little dharma talk with Nagarjuna. They got their heads huddled together talking about the view. And Tsongkhapa is sitting outside the circle. He's looking at them, and Buddhapalita sees him and comes over and touches his head with a book, right? So Buddhapalita is just known for one main book, and that book is conveniently called the Buddhapalita Commentary. Buddhapalita Virti is the commentary by Buddhapalita on Nagarjuna's treatise on the Middle Way. So, having had that dream, Tsongkhapa opens up Buddhapalita's commentary to chapter 18, the first verse, where it says, the self, if the self were one with the aggregates of mind and body, it would have to arise and disintegrate moment by moment. But if the self were something other than the aggregates of mind and body, it could exist completely independently of them, utterly apart from them, right? And we've heard this before in different forms, the argument that this self and other, something can't, exist intrinsically if it can't be found as either one with or different from the basis of imputation. But when he read it this time, in the context of all this prior practice, he came to awakening. So this is understood as the moment in which Tsongkhapa, has direct realization of the view. And then, according to tradition, he immediately composed his Praise to Dependent Arising, which we'll read a few excerpts from here in a little while. Praise to Dependent Arising is a praise to the Buddha as the teacher of dependent arising. And so in the poem, it's sort of an ecstatic poem of realization. Tsongkhapa is saying, what higher praise could I give the Buddha beyond celebrating him as the speaker of the teaching of dependent arising, right? So in 1402, at the age of 46, he composed the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment. And he, in the beginning of the book and the end of the book, he says that it's based on Atisha's Lamp for the Path. Although at the end of the book, he also cites a whole bunch of other books from the stage of the teaching and stage of the path, like tradition that he was also drawing on. But in the beginning of the book, he mentions Atisha in the beginning and the end. But in the beginning of the book, if you read the first part of volume 1, it's a 3-volume translation. This is all in translation. If you read the beginning of volume 1, it's all about Atisha. Because he says you should start out a commentary on text by talking about the qualities of the teacher. And he talks about Atisha and his life and his qualities. That's the beginning of the stages of the path to enlightenment. And then you could say, well, maybe he sees Lama Rinpoche, the Great Treatise on the Stage of the Path to Enlightenment, as kind of a big commentary on Lamp for the Path by Atisha. That would maybe make sense because it uses the 3 capacities of beings as a kind of big structure. But except for the 3 capacities of being structure, he doesn't heavily quote Atisha or Lamp for the Path. He quotes every possible, sutra and shastra from every tradition, but it's not it's not in any way a commentary on Atisha. But the weirdest thing is that in addition to starting out sort of as though he's going to write a commentary on Atisha's text, he says, and this is very clear, right? He says, the author of this book is Atisha. This book, right? The one that he's writing. Okay, so you have to decide, what does that mean, right? Maybe he thinks by this book, he means the book on which he's writing a commentary, or is he, following through on this identification, this vision of Atisha that he had when he was 7, right? And in a sense, consciously, subconsciously, right, institutionally, prophetically, sort of casting himself as the new Atisha. In any case, this book, which is quite long, details the idea of a gradual path to enlightenment from a Mahayana Sutra perspective. And according to the tradition, Tsongkhapa initially feared that readers would be unable to understand the last part of the book where he explains his view of emptiness, and that a vision of Manjushri inspired him to complete the composition. So people make a parallel between this and the story about, Buddha becoming awakened under the tree and then hesitating about whether to go out and teach. And then the gods come and say, you have to go out and teach, right? And then he's like, oh, okay, I'll go out and teach. Maybe some people will be helped, right? And so like that, he has this hesitation, according to tradition, about the last part of the book. So the last part of the book is much more difficult than the other parts of the book. And the reason is that, when you go through describing the stages of the path, you rely on a spiritual teacher, you take refuge in the 3 jewels, you make commitments to avoid non-virtue. None of this is philosophically difficult. It's just hard to do it all properly, right? And then, you eventually think about, the faults of cyclic existence and cultivate an attitude of renunciation. And then eventually you get around to cultivating the bodhicitta, the spirit of awakening and mind of awakening, aspiring to become a Buddha for the sake of others. And then you start in with the perfections, right? And then this is the way he sets it up, and you go up through perfections, and then eventually you get to the 6th perfection, the perfection of wisdom. And then he describes, this is how we're going to meditate on emptiness. Well, the first thing would be identifying the object of negation. What is emptiness? The absence of. And when you read descriptions on how to practice these days, or even those days, right? it would be like how to do that in meditation, like by imagining that someone's falsely accused you of stealing something. You've heard that, right? It's like imagine that someone's falsely accused you of something that you haven't really done, and like what does yourself feel like at that time, and try to spy from a corner of your mind and see what this exaggerated sense of self is like, right? So he doesn't say any of that. He has a big fat book, and the section on identifying the object of negation is the huge and most difficult part of it, and it never mentions that bit that I just said, which is in all the other guide books to how to meditate on the view. Instead, what he means by identification of the object of negation is a philosophical identification of the object of negation, and a philosophical identification of the object that rules out any possible overinterpretation of it that negates too much, and rules out any possible interpretation that doesn't negate enough. And in doing that, he shows how, in effect, that this view, his view, that emptiness is the lack of inherent existence, and it doesn't cancel out existence, right, is backed up by the teachings of Chandrakirti, which a lot of people thought otherwise. Like a lot of people understood Chandrakirti's Prasangika view as a sort of radical, skeptical kind of view. It's the most radical understanding of emptiness that's in the Buddhist tradition. And other people who adopted that view come off as skeptics at best, and maybe sometimes from Tsongkhapa's point of view as nihilists. So how to interpret Chandrakirti's Prasangika Madhyanga point of view while preserving, the idea of ethical distinctions between virtue and non-virtue. He tries to show how to do that. That's the big trick, how to avoid the extremes of nihilism and fundamentalism. And so instead of saying, this is how you will do it in meditation, he describes, philosophically how it can be made coherent, right, to solve this problem. And I haven't told you how he does that yet, but he does do something. I know it's a little hard to explain, but once you get it, you can see, oh, why didn't anybody else think of that? It really is a kind of a genius move. So, so he performs these 4 great deeds, which I'm not spending a lot of time on. 1405, he composed the Great Treatise on the stages of Tantra, or secret mantras, actually, what we say. The Great Treatise on the stages of secret mantra, which is Tantra. The first 1402 book, Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment, ends by saying, if you've done everything else in this book up to now, find a guru and begin to enter the tantric path, right? And then it just sort of describes just, that's what you need to do. But then he's like, well, we have to follow up and describe how to actually do that and what exactly Tantra is. So that's what he does with the, you could say, sequel. Yes, sort of. I don't know if that's the right word, but thinking of the Hollywood movies, right? Yeah. So he composes a number of other important texts. 1407 and 1408, he composes a commentary on the root text of the Madhyamaka tradition, Nagarjuna's fundamental verses on the middle way. That text is called Ocean of Wisdom, usually, Rikpa Gyatso, and it's all translated. All these books are pretty much in English now. All these the important texts of Tsongkhapa on the view are in English. Rikpa Gyatso is translated by Jay Garfield together with I think his name Losang Sanden, the principal of at Sarnath. What is it called? It's a university now, not higher. It's not the Sarnath Institute of Tibet. It's not the Higher Institute for Higher Learning. It's called the CUTS, Central University of Tibetan Studies, is what the new name. And the principal of that school is a Tibetan scholar. He worked with Jay Garfield and translated that whole book. And then he did a shorter treatise on the interpretation of scripture that's one of the most difficult books by Tsongkhapa. Metaphorically, it's referred to as the steel bow. And mastering this text, which I think Thurman calls the essence of eloquence, and he has a translation of, to master that book is like called drawing the steel bow, metaphorically in the Tibetan tradition. But it's short enough that the hotshot, practitioners in the monastery just memorize the whole book, right? They memorize it. And then, go over it and over every syllable and again until they, understand what's this distinction Tsongkhapa was trying to make. 1415, he composed the medium-length treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment, which you can see some of at least in Thurman's early translation. And then I guess there's I'm not sure if there's been a new version, but there is. Yeah. The medium length.
Didn't Geshe-la comment on, the middle length by somebody?
Yeah. Yeah. It is easier to understand. And some people have called it like a summary, because Lama Rinpoche was so, Great Treatise was so hard. But he wrote it several years later, and it isn't exactly a summary. It does repeat points that are in the other book. Obviously, it's covering the same territory, but I find it interesting to read as a separate work independently. But of course, it does address the issue of identifying the object of negation in a more this is the way you practice it way instead of this is the way you understand it philosophically. No, I've only the middling. I haven't read all of it in Tibetan. I've looked at the English, and then I will can check the Tibetan and see what people were saying. Tsongkhapa founded Ganden Monastery, initiated the Great Prayer Festival in Lhasa. So I'm not an expert on Great Prayer Festival, but Tibetan New Year has always been a big thing, and it seemed to me, just looking at it from the outside in some sense, that Merlam Chemo is kind of like taking a time when everybody's going to have a big party anyway, and consecrating it, right, and connecting it to the Dharma, right. Essentially, the effect of that. And then Tsongkhapa dies at Ganden, the monastery he founded as the center of the tradition, in 1419, the year after he'd composed his last big text on Madhyamaka, Gompa Rapsal, we call it in Tibetan. Illumination of the thought is what Jeffrey Hopkins says. Elucidation of the thought is good. A commentary on Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way. Chandrakirti wrote 2 commentaries on Nagarjuna's treatise on the Middle Way. And this is important because Chandrakirti is the Prasangika interpreter, right? The main Prasangika interpreter of the Madhyamaka tradition of Nagarjuna. And he wrote 2 commentaries on that root text. And one of them is like a word for word. It's a commentary that goes line for line, looks at what is Nagarjuna saying here? What does he mean here? And he explains it. And that's called Clear Words. And then the other one is completely different. You would say it's presented as a commentary, but you can think of it as a supplementary commentary in some sense, and sort of explaining, if you're a follower of Madhyamaka as expounded by Nagarjuna, how would you go about practicing the path as a bodhisattva, right? So that's what you get a little bit more in the elucidation of the middle way. And some of that's been translated in English. So he's 62. He'd had so many students, right? You can't begin to count the important ones. Down to today, we just mostly focus on K-Drup and Gyaltsap. Gyaltsap was originally a teacher who he was already established as a teacher, and then I think he thought he was going to debate with Tsongkhapa, and then was converted over to being one of his lead followers. K-Drup, on the other hand, was one of Tsongkhapa's closer followers from early on after his arrival in central Tibet. Gelsup and K-Drup then succeeded Tsongkhapa in leadership at Ganden. Shakya Yeshe. So the Chinese emperor, either once or twice, depending on what book you read, like sent ambassadors requesting that Tsongkhapa come on over to the capital and be his teacher. And Tsongkhapa declined and sent the student Shakya Yeshe instead. Gendin Drupa, who was posthumously identified as the first Dalai Lama. So there wasn't like a Dalai Lama then, but there was Gendin Drupa. And then his reincarnation was recognized. And then that guy's reincarnation was recognized, Sonam Gyatso. And then the Altan Khan, took Sonam Gyatso as his teacher and said, "You're the Dalai Lama or the Ocean Lama." And so his two previous incarnations, right, were retrospectively Dalai Lamas. Do you see? Because the name was only applied with the third. The founder of Drepung Monastery also. Among his and Sarah as well among his students. There's a lot of emphasis on K-Drup and Gelsup today, but there were so many other students, who it was a thing, right? It's like Dolpopa had a big surge of enthusiasm for Dolpopa in the previous century, and then in the 15th century, Tsongkhapa's following caught on in a similar way and became really important. So, next I want to talk about Tantra. You don't have to have any special initiation in order to hear this discussion. André Breton is known as the father of surrealism. Surreal is the idea of surreal is sort of the idea of something that goes beyond the distinction that we ordinarily have between the real and the imaginary. That was the idea behind that word. And he has a couple of famous quotes attributed to André Breton, but one is, "The imaginary is what tends to become real," right? So you think it's like, well, will there be lobster telephones in the future and so forth? But that's Dali. But melting clocks, I mean, yes, there will be in the gift store at the Dali Museum. But the imaginary is what tends to become real. And I like to, invite my students to play around with the idea, like, okay, to what degree does a Buddhist in general, or Tantric Buddhist in particular, accept the proposition that the imaginary is what tends to become real? And so the first thing I think is like, well, people are constantly imagining that they have some kind of a permanent self, or that they exist by way of their own nature. And they've been doing that beginninglessly and it has yet to become even slightly real. So that's an important exception to that. I was like, some things are sort of impossible in the nature. It's the nature of things for them to be impossible, and no matter how long you imagine it, you can't make it come about. But on the other hand, if something is possible, right? Could I be a dolphin? Well, yeah, in another lifetime, right? I could be a dolphin. So if I obsessively meditate on dolphin, dolphin, doesn't that create predispositions for me to be reborn as a dolphin? I mean, I would have to have a little bit of bad karma, do you know what I'm saying? But not too much. Right? That's like a somewhat sharp-minded animal, right? And yeah, I mean, presumably I already have all the necessary karma to reborn as a dolphin. So what will make me be reborn as a dolphin in my next lifetime? Well, if I focus on that, if I meditate on that, I'm planting seeds, mental acts that create, predispositions for me to be reborn in that way. And this isn't something that's like, just made up in Tantra, right? This goes back to the very beginning of Buddhism when people ask the Buddha, and this is in the Pali Canon, so all these other teachers tell us who created the world. Who created the world anyway? And the Buddha said, well, the mind creates the world. The mind creates the world. So there's a lot of things there's so many levels of meaning in that, right? And it could very well be that the main meaning originally was the intentions, the volitions, the choices that we make with our mind is karmically what causes, future worlds to appear, right? But it could mean other things, more philosophical things too, that, conceptual imputation of things as tables and rugs and so forth. But the mind creates the world is like, what you place your mind on, if it's something that's possible, is what will tend to come about. It depends on something about what other people's minds are doing too, comes into play, right? But this is, not you could say that the idea of Tantra is a fulfillment of something that was latent in Buddhism from the very beginning, is to systematically use the mind and direct our minds to help shape or recreate our future in better ways, right? So in that way, I think André Breton, that Buddhists agree with André Breton, that the imaginary is what tends to become real, assuming that what you're imagining is in any way, shape, or form, possible, if it's not absolutely precluded. And that's, I don't know. I wanted to start with that because this is sort of the key to understanding how Tsongkhapa can integrate, the highest yoga tantra traditions and the tantra traditions in general into the monastic curriculum. Because this is how he understands Tantra. And it goes back to the very beginning of Buddhism and this idea of imagining what you wish to have come about and saying, yeah, Tantra is the full-blown application of that principle. What do we want to have come about? We want to become Buddhas. So why are we thinking about dolphins, right? Do you see what I'm saying? That's the basic idea. So, So you can see the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Secret Mantra. I think it's all been translated into English. Of course, Tsongkhapa wrote many other tantric texts. So 18 volumes of text that he wrote is pretty much half Tantra and half not Tantra. So Tantra is not that's half of his list. He was, and when you read, who he's getting teaching from, he's getting Guya Samaja over here and Kala Chakra over there and Vajrabhaira, and then he was doing Dharmakirti, and then he's studying Asanga. I mean, he was doing all of this stuff. So he wrote about what he understood from all of it and explained it. And so in the first English volume of this translation, it's Jeffrey's Tantra in Tibet. Jeffrey Hopkins, he sort of lays out what is distinct about Tantra and what isn't, and how do we understand that. And I just sort of boiled this down to some bullet points here. The difference between Hinayana path and a Mahayana path is in the method. In other words, anybody who's going to get out of cyclic existence has to realize the profound emptiness. If you have any arhats who are not bodhisattvas, but they've gone to a solitary peace and completely escaped cyclic existence, it's not by realizing a superficial emptiness. They have to realize the profound emptiness, right? And so then the difference between a Hinayana path and a Mahayana path is not going to be in the profundity of their view. It might be, well, it is, that in Mahayana they're much more fully elaborated and detailed explanations of the profound emptiness. But, if you look carefully and with a charitable eye, you can see where there are things in the Pali Canon that could, are be consistent with the profound emptiness view. So similarly, mantra, which Tantra Vajrayana. Its difference with the perfection vehicle or the sutra-based path is also the method side, not the wisdom side. So Mahayana adds in bodhicitta, the aspiration to awakening for the sake of all beings, and that distinguishes it, not the view, that distinguishes it from Hinayana. Mantra, again, has the same view. This is important, right? Because not necessarily everybody would agree with this in all the different traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, that mantra does not have a more profound view of what the ultimate reality is, right? It's the same view, but it has a difference of method. And that method in this case is the practice of deity yoga. So this is the thing, the distinguishing feature of Tantra, generally, Tantra as a whole, right? These are different classes of Tantras. The distinguishing feature of Tantra from sutra-based Mahayana practice is not sex, right? It's deity yoga, right? Not to say that there isn't sex in some of the Tantras, right? But like, for example, one of the arguments as to why sex can't be a distinguishing feature is it's not necessarily present, at least in any obvious way, equally in all the Tantras, right? And another reason, which is brought up, is that there are instances in which sex could be a bodhisattva practice without being a tantrika. So suppose you were the prince of a kingdom, right? And if you don't have an heir, there will be a total chaos and disaster, right? So you have sex in order to save the world, essentially, right? And this example, I mean, maybe it doesn't happen that often, but it is like brought up to make the point that, you know, sexual activity can be a bodhisattva practice, and even if you're not tantric, and conversely, you can be doing tantra a lot without engaging in sexual activity. So the Tsongkhapa makes these distinctions in a way that, like, you know, makes it possible to integrate the tantric tradition. It doesn't have to throw away any part of it and say, well, these aren't really the words of Buddha. The practice of deity yoga is important because it leads to much more rapid accumulation of merit. But as a general feature, Tantra greatly speeds up the progress of the path, to progress up to the path of seeing, not beyond. So Tsongkhapa says that, like, you know, there's 4 classes of Tantra. And in general, these Tantras will help you accumulate merit much more quickly and help you get to the point of seeing ultimate reality directly much more quickly. Beyond that, of getting from that point of, you know, being a superior and seeing ultimate reality directly, getting from there to Buddhahood, you're not necessarily going to go faster unless you use the highest yoga tantra practices. Perfection and mantra vehicles within Mahayana both have a similitude of Buddha's truth body. So Buddha has this truth body or embodiment of truth, which we understand to be the Buddha's wisdom, knowing, emptiness, which is non-dual, together with the emptiness of the mind, realizing emptiness, right? And this is the truth body. And then the form body, or bodies, right, is the Buddha's nirmanakaya, or manifestations, the various manifestations in the world to help beings, including, say, Siddhartha. That was one, right? That's just one example. There can be many other manifestations, right? And then also a Sambhogakaya, that is the Buddha's body as exists, bliss and light in a pure land, right? So if you meditate on emptiness, you're getting, what you want to do in the practice is try to get close to what you want to be like as the goal of practice, right? You're practicing for something, so you want your practice to conform to that which you're attempting to become, right? So when you meditate on emptiness, you're trying to make your mind conform to the Buddha's truth body as an outcome, right? But what do you do to make your body conform to the image of a Buddha's, form bodies, right? Try to appear in many different places at the same time, and right. And So this is the idea, is that he's saying that the Mahayana Sutra path doesn't have, a practice that helps you make your body, prepare your body to become a form body. And you can't become a Buddha without a form body. You can't just say, "Oh, I'll just keep the truth body and I'll not bother with the other one." That isn't a thing, right? You can't do that. If you just meditate on emptiness and you don't, can't become a Buddha, then even if you're a bodhisattva, you won't ultimately become a Buddha. And if you're not a bodhisattva, of course, then you go to solitary peace of an arhat nirvana. So there's maybe Tantra is a big culture in India, not just Buddhism. It was a wave, just like bhakti. Bhakti was a wave, and Buddhism was part of popularity of different forms of Tantra practice. So Hinduism, especially among the Shaivites, worshippers of Shiva, have their own forms of Tantra. But there's also Tantras that are devoted to goddesses, Hindu goddesses that are not Buddhist, right? So there are quite a few different Tantras, right? The Tantric milieu, right, was something that spread across between Hinduism and Buddhism. But of course, the difference is that they don't have meditation on emptiness, right? Then you get into well, what about Dolpopa? He doesn't have meditation on emptiness as we understand it. He's meditating on emptiness as a one supreme absolute truth with a capital S self. And if he is, then how is that actually different from Hinduism? Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know. So maybe somebody will explain that to me. But I this makes me a partisan, but I can't help it. I've never made sense of that. So Buddhist deity yoga means causing the mind realizing emptiness and fused with emptiness to itself appear as a deity of compassion in order to help others. So one thing said is that Tantra, speeds up the practice of the path, at least up to the level of the path of seeing, even with the lower Tantras. And how does it do that? Because it brings together method and wisdom in a single entity better or more thoroughly, more deeply than. So how do we try to combine loving care and wisdom if you're doing the 6 perfections? Well, the way you do it is you understand emptiness, motivated by compassion, you engage in acts of generosity and patience and so forth. So you're not necessarily realizing emptiness at that time, but you have, in the context of an understanding and a recalled understanding from past experience that things are empty, you're motivated by compassion. You do some stuff to help other people or to not harm other people at least, right? Okay. So that's as close as you can get to, in the sutra way, to fusing wisdom and compassion. They're not actually, the power of the wisdom is latent in the mind, right, at that time, but you're not actually realizing emptiness at the same time. So how could you get wisdom and compassion closer together than that? And this is the idea in Tantra, is what appears to your mind when you realize emptiness? In the sutra way, it's space-like. And the Buddha actually, says this, as space is the best example for those of us that don't understand emptiness to think of, what emptiness is like. And when people realize emptiness conceptually, in a sutra way, it's like space opens up because this obstructive contact disappears. And so the obstruction of inherent existence vanishes away. And it's like this clearing or opening up of things, right? So it's like space. So emptiness appears like space. But space doesn't have this quality of active compassion that you're trying to get the form body. So what if you could have the mind that's knowing emptiness? I mean, what's so special about space? Well, I just told you. But does it have to be space? Everything's empty. Space is empty, yeah, but other things are empty too once you understand emptiness. So why don't we see if we can have the mind that's knowing emptiness have appear before it in that moment of knowing emptiness an image of a compassionate, blissful being? Do you see what I'm saying? That's a good trick, right? It's hard to do, right? But that's the idea, right? Is if instead of this open, spacious image that appears to our mind. So they distinguish between, in the mind, a factor of cognition or understanding, right? And a factor of appearance. So when I think about chocolate ice cream cone, when I think about ice cream cone or something like that, I can make up a definition of an ice cream cone. But there's also like a little picture in my mind, which was obviously a chocolate ice cream cone because I just said it. It was like, so there's a difference between what's appearing in my mind and what I'm understanding. They're not exactly the same, but they're there at the same time. That's what Deity Yoga is trying to do. It's saying, well, okay, we're going to use both of those. We're going to have the cognition factor is going to be an understanding of emptiness. And at that very time, the appearance factor is going to be the appearance of this form body that's, sending out waves of blessings towards all these suffering beings and so forth like that. Right? That's the idea. And then in that way, Deity Yoga enables you to bring together on the path wisdom and compassion in a single moment of mind. And because you're therefore much more thoroughly, setting the stage for becoming a Buddha, that it moves you toward Buddhahood more quickly. That's the idea. It's like, if I wanted to be like a really good tennis player and I tried to copy a pro, the more accurately I could copy the pro, the better I would be, obviously. So it's just like that. So when we talk about Vajrayana, Vajra is translated a lot of different ways and could have different meanings. Originally it goes back to the Vedic god Indra, who was a thunder god, and he had thunderbolts like Thor, and he would throw these thunderbolts. And anything thunderbolt would hit would get smashed, right? Which was like lightning, right? So lightning, A, goes really fast, and B, breaks anything that it hits and is itself unbreakable. So Vajra has, both of those symbolic meanings. So then people translate it as adamantine or diamond. It's not wrong, whereas you say lightning, it's not really wrong either. It's just coming off of a different aspect of that original meaning. And if you say lightning, then you're emphasizing, well, Vajrayana is the super fast vehicle. We took the big bus of Mahayana that holds infinite beings, and we souped up the engine, right? So it's a lightning, put a lightning on the side of it, right? So it could be like that, but the main meaning that Tsongkhapa explains is the other one, that Vajra means this sort of unbreakable union or fusion of loving care and wisdom, right, together in a single moment of mind, right, in the practice of Deity Yoga. Attainment of Buddhahood in one lifetime of this era is a feature only of the highest yoga tantras, not the others. And then it turns out, well, what if you just wanted to stick with action tantra? Maybe you get to be a Buddha eventually. No, it turns out that you ultimately have to enter into the highest yoga tantra in order to become a Buddha, according to Great Treatise on Stages of Secret Mantra. So I don't know if I can say exactly why you have to, but I can say what the sort of critical thing is, and that is that the sort of subtlest and deepest kind of mind that we have in highest yoga tantra is the mind of clear light, which isn't explained elsewhere. And if you can, where this mind occurs, we have it, but we don't notice it. We don't know how to use it. If you can learn to notice it and use it, right, this mind of clear light, then if you can use that mind of clear light to realize emptiness, then you just cut like a laser beam through all the gunk of, that we've accumulated beginninglessly, right? And otherwise, if you just get the Brillo pad out, it's going to be like a lot harder or maybe impossible. So that's the idea. So, right, the techniques, the distinctive techniques of highest yoga tantra involve a lot of other things, right? Which we don't have to get into, but the crucial feature is this idea of using something that's already part of who we are, but we don't notice it, this subtle mind of clear light, and using that mind to realize emptiness. This is very difficult to see because it's hard to understand emptiness, and then it's hard to realize emptiness, and then to realize emptiness from within the mind of clear light. It sounds impossible when I think about it. It just seems. But then I went to Cirque du Soleil and I saw several impossible things, and so, do you know what I'm saying? And I remember. So this is a long time ago when we had typewriters, and there was a Tibetan Lama staying at Jeffrey's house, coming and teaching this at University of Virginia, and Betsy Napper was typing about 100 words a minute, going along like this on the typewriter, and he's like, he thought it was super. He thought she had a city or something. It was super normal, like. That must be just garbage that you're producing. And then he would look at it and it's like, oh, it doesn't make any sense. It seems impossible that a person can move the fingers that fast and then produce coherent text coming out the other end. Well, it's not impossible. It's a result of practice, right? I just throw that out there because I want to defeat my own idea about the impossibility of realizing emptiness with mind and clear. It appears to my mind as impossible is not the same as impossible. Okay. Practitioners, so different commentators on the Tantras, including commentators from India. Tsongkhapa in Great Treatise on Secret Mantra, Stages of Secret Mantra, refutes some Indian explainers of the Tantras. There's different theories about how the different Tantras relate to each other and for whom they're intended. And Tsongkhapa, refutes these and organizes it in his own way. And so for example, the 4 classes of Tantra, some people say, well, this one's for people who especially have desire as a strong affliction, and these are for people who have especially, anger or hatred as a strong affliction, and these are people who have, and the highest yoga tantras are people who have desire as an especially a strong affliction. And Tsongkhapa, so he just has to refute all of these ideas that the tantras are, intended for these different classes, are intended for people who have different kinds of predominant afflictions. Instead, the basic idea is, okay, all bodhisattvas have great compassion. If you're a bodhisattva, meaning that, from the depths of your heart, you sincerely wish to relieve this suffering and are dedicated to relieving the suffering of all living beings without exception. Right? Trump. Right? So, a lot of suffering. So you have to be all inclusive. But among bodhisattvas, Tsongkhapa makes a distinction in terms of the degree of intensity. It's like an intensity of your great compassion, urgency, burningness, essentially, like that. So, you would think if somebody's, mother was trapped in a burning building that they would want to save them. But maybe some people would be more willing to run into the building and pull them out than others. There's fire in there, right? And so this is this sense of like, I got to call the fire department versus I got to get in there right away, right? It's like, of course you want to save all your mothers from cyclic existence. And it's like, well, how much are you willing to do? How much risk are you willing to take, right? How dangerous and treacherous a path are you willing to, go along in order to make that happen faster, right? That's how he understands it. So people have especially intense, great compassion are bodhisattvas who can be, more qualified to practice highest yoga tantra. And then, most importantly, secret mantra does not set aside any of the elements of the sutra path, bodhicitta, the aspiration to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings, practice of the six perfections, the mind realizing emptiness. It's not like Tantra has some others, in Tsongkhapa's way, some other special truth that you realize, right? That's beyond emptiness or is different from emptiness. So, that being the case, all of the perfection vehicle practices are indispensable to and constitute the very substance of the highest yoga tantra path, and none of them should be set aside. Of course, the reason Tsongkhapa has to say that is because that's exactly what a lot of people were doing. And I mean, I don't know. I don't want to say what people are doing. Who knows? But there is a strong tendency to think, well, I'm not going to bother with all that other stuff. That's probably the way to look. I know that highest yoga tantra is the best, so I'm going to do that. Why would I do anything lower? Why would I practice any of these lower things? Right? This is something that Tsongkhapa is constantly pushing back against, is probably the most judicious way to say it. He says, like a sign of progress is on the path is that when you do all the basic practices and then you move on to a higher level, when you get onto a higher level, if it inspires you to go back and do the earlier ones again and even better, that's a sign of progress. A sign of progress is not skipping over all the earlier ones or discarding them or thinking, yeah, I got rid of all of that stuff. It's like, being willing to engage them over and over again. So His Holiness is like, it was mentioned that in 2008 at Lehigh, he gave teachings on the Great Treatise of the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment, which he did only after the whole thing was translated into English. And when he did that, he did not go through the book line by line, even though he taught for 4 days. He just picked stuff out, all kinds of interesting stuff, and talked about it. And one of the things he riffed on for quite a while was refuge. And he said, well, there's a lot of people who say they're Buddhists and they say they take refuge in the three jewels, but they don't really know what the three jewels are. And then he started like talking about, the three jewels in a deeper and deeper way. And so I was like, well, what is the true refuge among the three jewels of the Dharma? And what does the Dharma really mean? It means understanding the nature of reality. And like, if you don't understand the Buddhist presentations about the nature of reality, it's like I started thinking, maybe there are only a few Buddhists in this auditorium, because he's going to draw the line, But that wasn't his point. His point is it's like, if you feel that you are a Buddhist, you should, want to understand the Dharma more and more deeply rather than just saying, okay, I'm done with that refuge in the three jewels part. So going back to take refuge again, as you start to understand the emptiness better, then, it changes the nature of your refuge. Yeah. Okay. That seems like a place where I could take some questions, if anybody has any. Or I can keep going, but we're supposed to stop at 12, so it seems like a question time.
So, Professor, I have a question. And so basically, you have commented on the space-like samadhi when people have actually realized emptiness of phenomena. Yeah. So the question is, what is after that realization of space-like samadhi? And I was reading a book somewhere, and in the book, they actually have a very interesting account of people in Europe, in different places, have realized the space-like samadhi. And then after they realized the space-like samadhi, this is not before, even before they were Buddhists. They were just spontaneously realize that, everything is empty and there's space and nothing exists, and they become very disappointed with the whole phenomena. Mm.
Yeah, sort of fall into a nihilistic view as a result. Is that what you mean? Right. Yeah. Fall into a nihilistic view as seeing everything disappear. Right. Yeah. Well, So, it's hard. You don't want to generalize about people's experience. I think that sometimes, people can have very profound experiences, and one way to explain them in the Buddhist tradition is say like, well, they have predispositions from past lives of having done these kinds of meditations and then becoming spontaneously absorbed in them. So if you look at the traditional story of the life of Buddha, and I'm talking about the Siddhartha story, the traditional Siddhartha Gautama story. In that story, when he was a boy, he entered into some kind of samadhi-like condition when he was watching his father plow a field, right? And so it's easy for us to say, well, yeah, of course he would. But this was before he'd even left home, before he'd done all the fasting and he hadn't been taught how to meditate. And he just spontaneously went into this kind of condition. And when he was sitting under the Bodhi tree, he remembered that. And that helped guide him, right, into the kind of stability that led to his awakening. So, of course, we would understand, well, of course he would have that when he was a little boy because he'd been practicing stuff like that for a long time before, right? And so you can think of it as that in one way. Another thing is that in the third volume of Lama Chemo, Tsongkhapa talks about distinguishing between a kind of shimmering or hazy or illusion-like appearance that comes about through doing in deep or intense meditation, where you essentially get an altered state of consciousness where things don't look normal when you come out. And he said, anybody can get that. He said, that doesn't mean that you've realized emptiness. You know what I'm saying? So his way of understanding it is that and not necessarily all Tibetan Buddhists, but his way of understanding it is to realize emptiness, you have to understand emptiness. If you don't understand emptiness, then you're not meditating on it. It's true, other traditions may say differently, but that's how he understands it. Is saying if you want to meditate on it, you first have to understand the view, and then you have to focus your mind on what you've understood and go into deep stabilizing meditation on that, right? On that which you have understood first already. So then it makes you wonder if whether what people are sort of spontaneously having these altered states of consciousness that change their view of reality, whether, Tsongkhapa would really accept them as spontaneous realizations of emptiness. Probably he wouldn't. But one other thing I could say about that, it's a good question, is that suppose hypothetically, these people are having some kind of emptiness-like realization. When emerging from that realization or that space-like meditative equipoise, they see everything as pointless and meaningless, then they haven't realized the emptiness that Tsongkhapa is talking about. Because the meaning of emptiness is dependent arising. So he thinks, it's this is an example of people falling to an extreme of nihilism, right? By understanding that things are empty, but not understanding that the true emptiness, it's only empty things that can function as causes and conditions and effects. Right? So when you talk about emptiness, you're actually talking about all of the stuff and how it manages to work, that it wouldn't work at all if it weren't empty. Do you see what I'm saying? It wouldn't work at all. This is what Nagarjuna does this in the 24th chapter of his stanzas. He goes on about emptiness chapter after chapter. This is empty. This is empty. The going is empty. The self is empty. The aggregates are empty. Time is empty. It's nirvana is empty. The Buddha is empty. And then as you get to the 24th chapter, his imaginary opponent is pretty much fed up. And he's saying, if you say everything's empty, you've just destroyed the Four Noble Truths. You've destroyed the Three Jewels. We can't have any Buddhism. It doesn't make any sense if all these things are empty. And then Nagarjuna says, no, it's exactly the opposite. This is the only way these things can be true or work is if they don't have any fixed, essential, graspable nature. That's what makes things able to be and to interact. And so I haven't really, we're going to talk about this we could start this afternoon talking more about the Madhyamaka view. But yeah, when Tsongkhapa had this realization after, the dream about the 18th chapter of Buddha Apologetic Commentary, the first thing he did was write a praise for Buddha as the teacher of dependent origination. And it's not like in Nagarjuna didn't say it. In the 18th verse of the 24th chapter, he says, dependent arising is emptiness. That's what we mean by emptiness, is the way that things do not exist except through their complicated, ever-shifting interrelationships with one another. It doesn't mean that nothing exists or has any effect. It's the fact that things can't exist and don't exist and won't ever exist except through these interrelationships with other empty things. But it means that's how things work. That's what makes things work. So that's why we can have a Four Noble Truths and a Three Jewels, is because things are empty. That's what Nagarjuna, he flips it around on. But you can see why people would be afraid. Yeah.
I have a question. It's arisen for me more and more recently. Ray the Dharmakaya. The question has arisen for me why most teachers, if not all, practically all teachers, when they talk about the Dharmakaya, or even just when they give teachings, they never really mention much about the natural body of the Buddha, which is a part of the Dharmakaya, but only the truth body, because I think that could be in some way better understood and better connected to help people if they had more of an understanding of that.
Okay, I'll just tell you how I understand it, and because I'm not sure I 100% understand your question. So the way I understand it is that just as there are two aspects of the form body, there are also two aspects of the truth body. And the natural truth body is a way of talking about emptiness. It's the fundamental nature of all things. And it's indifferentiable from the Buddha's wisdom knowing emptiness, and Buddha knows it as indifferentiable. So in that sense, you can have Zen teachers who, do things like, what is this? And if you don't know that is Buddha's natural body, then, that shows where your Dharma eye has gotten to and where it hasn't, right? Because there isn't anywhere that emptiness, this is emptiness, it's not like emptiness in some special different place. This emptiness is all of how all this stuff is. So that's the way I understand it, is Buddha's natural body is emptiness, and it isn't literally everything, but it's inseparable from everything, and it isn't anywhere else but right here.
Thank you. Well, my question, just to finish,
Yeah.
my question maybe arises from the feeling or thought feeling that the natural body has to be related to a human being's own form, because we are a body and we're understanding it through our own body. And I guess my question is, would the natural body be related to what you call the form body? Because I really don't understand that.
Okay, so I have the idea that maybe you're using the word natural body to mean something different than... so I understand a natural body as the nature body, which means the fundamental nature of all things, including our bodies, but not specifically or only just our bodies. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I wasn't seeing it that way.
Yeah. So they say nature body and wisdom body. There's the wisdom truth body and the nature truth body in English. And the nature truth body means the body of Buddha as the fundamental nature of all things or anything, including our bodies. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. So one of the things I was curious is, in order to be arhat, you need to realize emptiness in a subtle level. But for Theravadan practitioners, if they practice Vaibhashika point of view, how do they become an arhat?
Oh, when they practice from a what point of view? Vaibhashika? Is that what you said, Vaibhashika? Right. Okay. Well, they can't. But that doesn't mean so. Vaibhashika is not the same as Theravada. Theravada, and people who are not Mahayanists but are Buddhists and practice and become arhats are not necessarily Theravadins. I mean, there have been, classically we say there are 18 different non-Mahayana sects of Buddhism, which is kind of a way of just saying there are a lot of different ones, and it's tangled, and there's subdivisions within some of them, so who knows exactly how to count. And, nowadays we think that, it's all just evolved down into, we just think of non-Mahayana Buddhism as equivalent to Theravada Buddhism. But Theravada Buddhism is based on the Pali Canon, and it's one way, to a substantial extent, based on the writings of Buddhaghosa, of understanding the Pali Canon. But suppose, you go back and look at the things in the Pali Canon and say, okay, so forget about Theravada. Is there anything in here which could be read as pointing towards or suggesting or giving any scriptural hint that would enable some practitioner to realize the profound emptiness? And I think there is, and I think there are some other people who think there is too. And so that way, I mean, it depends on whether you approach it as this is first turning of the wheel and I'm going to show how it's inferior, or you approach it as this is the word of Buddha and however other people have read it, I know it has some, I'm definitely going to take a charitable reading of it. Do you know what I'm saying? And you can read these texts as pointing at some of them you can read as pointing at a prasangika view, what I would argue. So as an example, and unfortunately I can't quote it off the top of my head, but there's a passage with the bhikkhuni Vajira, in which she's, tempted to egocentrism or nihilism, I can't remember, but in some way she's tempted to take a wrong view by Mara, and she responds to Mara with a kind of brief verse, describing how it is that the self that Mara is trying to, get her to believe in doesn't exist at all. So that's a passage that you can read as pointing toward the profound emptiness, in my opinion. Well, it's in the Pali Canon, so therefore it's a scripture of Theravada. But if you were Buddhaghosa, you might not read it in the same way that I just suggested, right? Yeah. I mean, that's right. There has to be some way. The thing is if Tsongkhapa is saying that there are non-Mahayanists who realize the profound emptiness, and in saying that, he's relying on Chandrakirti, so it's not just like he made that up. So where do they get that idea? And you can look at for example, I'll just say this: what sutras does Nagarjuna quote when he's explaining profound emptiness in the treatise on the middle way? They're all from the Pali Canon. All of them.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So for the Theravada, Vipassana meditation technique, for example, from my understanding, they teach it in a way that it's this is technique. If you keep using it, you can reach nirvana. Mm-hmm. But from my limited understanding, it seemed like it will help you to realize subtle impermanence and kind of more coarse level of selflessness, mm-hmm. but not necessarily more subtle level of emptiness. So I couldn't really make that connection, how it goes into nirvana eventually. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So the first part of what you're saying sort of suggests that by following vipassana, insight cultivation, meditative techniques, you're not realizing the profound emptiness, but a coarser emptiness. And then at the end, though, you said, well, you don't see how it necessarily leads into nirvana. So maybe what you mean by the subtle and profound emptiness that it's not clear how you're getting to is something non-conceptual. Is that what you mean? And that's why you're connecting the subtle emptiness to nirvana, which, that's true. So you mean something that transcends conceptual understanding, right? Yeah. Right. Okay, well, this is a question that's been, it's an important question. It's been around for a long time, right? Because, Bhava Viveka, for example, in the Madhyamaka tradition, he talks about, well, there's the ultimate that you realize when you're analyzing and meditating, but it's not the true ultimate, because the true ultimate is the ultimate truth that is, beyond description, is non-dual, and isn't the same ultimate that you realize analytically. That kind of fits with what you're saying, I think. So that's not what Tsongkhapa says. We'll look at these questions seem to be going in the direction of Madhyamaka, so that's where we'll go after lunch. But he has his lots of sources, that back up that it's a legitimate part of the Indian Buddhist tradition to say that analytical meditation is necessary to set the stage for non-dual, non-conceptual insight. And what it is that you have non-dual, non-conceptual insight into is that it has content, it has meaning, and it's the meaning that you have been thinking about and understanding before, right? So he doesn't see the ultimate as. I actually was present, in a conversation between another scholar and one of my Tibetan teachers just last year. And this guy has been spending all of his time studying Mipam, from the Nyingma tradition. And now he really wants to try to understand Gelukpa. And he can't understand why the Gelukpas would say that the emptiness that you realize conceptually is the same emptiness that you realize when you realize nirvana. It just doesn't make any sense to him. And I think that perspective of that just doesn't make sense to people is also found in Kagyupa as well, many teachers as well as Nyingma. But so the idea is that the idea of emptiness that we can think about as things utter lack of having any inherent existence. There's different ways to know or apprehend this truth. In other words, the truth that's understood is the same, but the manner of apprehension and the manner of appearance is completely different. That's how Tsongkhapa understands it. So as long as you're, understanding and analyzing and reasoning, emptiness appears to you in a certain way. And it can be very profound, right? It can still be very profound, but still have conceptual traces and aspects to it, right? But then there's a way in which you understand emptiness where you do not think, hey, I finally understand emptiness, or now I know that emptiness exists, or hey, this is what emptiness looks like. In fact, you don't even realize that emptiness exists, because at that time you only realize emptiness. There's nothing else. So what is the mind that posits the existence of emptiness? The existence of emptiness is posited by a conventional mind that you have after you come out of meditating on emptiness and say, whoa, I just realized emptiness. You can't posit that by way of that mind itself, because from the point of view of that mind, there's only emptiness. The idea of emptiness existing or me as a person realizing it, those are gone. Yeah. Okay. All right. Lunchtime, I think. Thank you much, everybody. We'll come back and talk more about Madhyamaka in the afternoon.